Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Rancho Mirage Library and Observatory. My name is Aaron Espinoza. If I can please ask you all to silence your cell phones. All right. I took a brief walk outside, and when I say brief, it was very brief, but I cannot tell you how thankful I am that you guys are here joining us today at the Rancho Mirage Library and Observatory when we have this beautiful weather outside. We've got snow on the mountains. We've got a world-class tennis tournament happening, and here you are standing in the community room of the Rancho Mirage Library and Observatory. So thank you guys for coming. I believe everybody got a book today. James will be signing books after the event. So if you want it personalized or you just want to say hi or make a comment to him, please line up along this side of the wall and we'll get you over to him as soon as we can. The Rancho Mirage Writers series is a opportunity for the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival to give back to our community. So this is our 23rd program and just since October, and we have two more coming up. On Tuesday, March 21st, we welcome veteran and 20 political campaigns and author of Any Given Tuesday, a political love story written by Liz Smith. Any Given Tuesday follows Smith from her earliest experience as a college-age intern to her days as a trusted advisor and confidant to some of the most high-profile politicians in the country. So that is next Tuesday, the 21st at 2 p.m. Tuesday, the 28th, we have My Life in the Sunshine, which follows Nabil Ayer's path to an unorthodox childhood to his current post as the top music executive. Son of Ron Ayers, the memoir is about one man's journey to connect to his musician father, ultimately redefining what family really means. So those are our final two writer series for this season. I think you guys all experienced a little congestion on Highway 111 coming in. I would be happy to tell you that it's going to end before these next two programs. That would be a lie. Unfortunately, that is going to be happening. Our main intersection is actually going to be going under some construction starting next week. They wanted to start today, and we said, please don't. So please, if you are going to come to any of the Library and Observatory's programming or the Writer Series programs, please give yourself plenty of time. You know our parking lot stretches far down to the depths of the dirt lot, so it does take a little bit of time to get here. So please just give yourself a little bit of a time. The Writers Series would not be possible without the generous support of Jordan Snitzer and his funding from the Harold and Arlene Snitzer Care Foundation. So please give a round of applause to Jordan Snitzer. Our team works effortlessly throughout the whole year to produce all these amazing programs. We did a few programs in 2021 for the Writer Series, and we had a little bit of fun with it. We had 4 or 5 authors. As I mentioned, we had 25 this particular season, and that is all because one man got bored. And that gentleman is our founder, Jamie Kadler. So please thank Jamie. His boredom has led to these amazing 25 talks, and we are working on our writer series for next season, which we will continue to announce those as we have them come available. Today's program, James Kirchick is a columnist for Tablet Magazine, a writer-at-large for Airmail, and author of an instant New York Times bestseller, Secret City, The Hidden History of Gay Washington. A widely published journalist and historian, he has reported from over 40 countries, and his reportage, essays, reviews have all appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, LA Times, The Atlantic, the New York Review of Books, New York, Rolling Stone, Welt, The Spectator, the Times Literacy Supplement, among other publications here in the United States and around the world. Today, joining James on the stage is New York Times journalist and Writers Festival alumni, Adam Nagorny. Adam will be joining us in 2024 with his new book, The History of the New York Times. Let's sit back and enjoy a great conversation. Please welcome James Kirchick and Adam Nagorny.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you for that very generous introduction. I'm honored to be here with Jamie. Doing this for a second time. We did this once in Los Angeles, but this was...
Moved to Washington after university to work at the New Republic magazine, a political magazine. And I've always been a lover of history, a student of history. And at Yale, I studied under Professor John Lewis Gaddis, who's the Dean of Cold War Studies. And he was writing a biography of George Kennan at the time, which won the Pulitzer Prize, the great Cold War strategist. And he taught a seminar on the art of biography. And I took it my junior year, and we had to choose a subject to write about. Anyone whose papers were at Yale. And so I chose a man named Larry Kramer, who some of you might know. There are reasons for that. I mean, which I learned, researching this book. And I realized that in this period of time during the Cold War, and really for most of the 20th century, there was no secret in Washington as a politician or a government employee. There was no secret that was more dangerous to your career than being gay. It was actually more dangerous to be gay than to be a communist. And we can talk about that. And so I realized this is such a fascinating, rich subject. Homosexuality was a sin, obviously condemned in the Old Testament. It was a crime in every state in the country. And it was a mental condition. You could be sent to a mental institution, you could be lobotomized, you could be castrated. But around World War II is when homosexuality becomes an important governmental secrets and information. And so you really see this dramatic transformation in our countries and our societal attitude towards homosexuality beginning around World War II, and then it really becomes much more intense paranoia with the rise of Joe McCarthy and the Cold War. And so it just seemed like a great topic, and to go through every president from FDR all the way to Bill Clinton, and look at the ways in which this around then, and then I had to put it aside for a couple of years because I moved overseas to work as a foreign correspondent, and I came back and really got into the research and the writing. I would say cumulatively it probably took 5 years of researching and writing it.
And was Larry...
And he would always ask, is this guy gay? Or he's gay, and Larry, maybe half of those people.
Was age and AIDS an issue in finding people you could interview to tell the story?
So yeah, the research was a combination of a lot of declassifying government documents, FBI, State Department, the Civil Service Commission, reading old newspaper articles and magazines, oral histories, and then interviews. And most of the people I approached were very happy to talk. Obviously, as you say, a lot of the people who I would have liked to have interviewed for this book passed away because of AIDS, or when you're writing about the 1930s and the 1940s,
People just die.
People die and they're not around anymore. I mean, they're about Ronald Reagan and the conservative movement basically taking over the party, and they tried to basically flummox his campaign. They tried to end. This was sort of a revivification of that. And Bob Livingston was a freshman congressman, and he was sort of a part of this group. And I knew at some point I was going to have to interview him about this. And no one knew about this. I mean, I found the materials because the Washington Post investigated this, but they never printed anything about it. And I was doing some research one day in Ben Bradley's papers, the former executive editor of the Washington Post, the legendary Watergate figure. His papers are at the University of Texas. And I was just looking through all the boxes. I mean, he's something like 500 boxes of documents. And there was one file, and the title of the file was, Ronald Reagan, allegations about 1980. I'm like, oh, that sounds interesting. And so I took out this file, and I found all these reporters' notes. I mean, Bob Woodward was involved in this investigation, and Lou Cannon, who, the dean of California political journalists, he was at the Washington Post. They were all involved in this investigation. And, Bob Livingston's name came up in here, and so I knew I was going to have to go interview him. And this was around September 2019, so it was the impeachment of Donald Trump over the Ukrainian business. And I knew that if I called Bob Livingston's office and I said, there's this sort of weird gay scandal that your boss was involved in. Bob Livingston today is one of the most powerful lobbyists in Washington. I knew that if I called up his secretary and said, can I schedule a meeting with your boss to ask him about that time he tried to accuse Ronald Reagan of being the Manchurian candidate of a right-wing homosexual cabal, I was probably not getting an appointment with him. So I said something vague about, I want to talk to him about Republican politics in the 1980s or something. And so I go into his office, and apparently he assumed that I was there to talk about impeachment, because he was very much involved in the Clinton impeachment. And there was another impeachment going on of another president, Donald Trump, and he was getting a lot of press inquiries about the impeachment process. So he assumed that I was just another journalist coming to talk to him about impeachment. And so we sit down at his desk, and the first question out of my mouth is, do you remember where you were on the evening of May 25th, 1980? And his face just turned white as I started saying the details and the names of the people involved. And what started this was, he had gone out to dinner with some closeted gay Republican lobbyist, and they had a lot to drink, and they were talking about the gay rumors around Ronald Reagan staffers and Jack Kemp. There are all these gay rumors about Jack Kemp. And then by the end of the evening, this man put his hand on Bob Livingston's knee, and he got so terrified that this was like 2 a.m, he drove all the way to the basement of the Capitol in Washington and spent the night sleeping in the members' gym of the United States Capitol building, because this lobbyist was involved with the Contras, and he was afraid that these right-wing gays were going to assassinate him. I mean, it sounds absolutely crazy, but it all happened.
Sounds like White Lotus, actually.
Yeah, White Lotus. I refer to it in the book as 3 days of the boys in the band. Okay. It's sort of a very strange story, and we spoke for about 5 or 6 minutes, and I saw that he was not very forthcoming and did not really want me in that room, and it was one of the shortest interviews I've ever conducted as a journalist. But beside that, no, most people that I approached were happy to talk.
Can you, based on what you've found in doing this book, describe what it was like to be a gay man or a lesbian living and working in Washington at the starting around World War II or FDR?
So you have to understand how our country has dealt with national security secrets. And before World War II, we didn't have this whole notion of national security was not even a notion then. And there's a famous quote from Henry Stimson, who was President Hoover's Secretary of State, who famously said, "Gentlemen don't read each other's mail." I mean, that was sort of the attitude that we had. And so we weren't collecting secrets like we do now, where there's a vast bureaucracy and, tens of billions of dollars every year. And there was a funny story I came across in my research. It was from the diary of President Roosevelt's naval aide. And he was walking down the street near the White House. And you have to remember that the State Department used to be in what is now called the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, right next to the White House. That's where the State Department used to be, directly next to the White House. He was walking to the White House, and he saw this piece of white paper floating in the air. This was sometime in the 1930s, so well before World War II. And he took the piece of white paper out of the air, and he looked at it, and it said, State Department, confidential, right? So this confidential document had just flown out the window of the State Department, and right on Pennsylvania Avenue, so that was how our country dealt with secrets, and that all became crazy to think. There are some former presidents who deal with secrets in the same sort of lackadaisical manner, but, so we're kind of going backwards in time. And I'm all in favor of declassifying more documents as a journalist. But then World War II changes everything, right? And the whole national security state begins, and it becomes much more intense with the Cold War. And the best description that I could come up with for what it was like to be a gay person in Washington during this era, it was sort of like being a dissident in an East Bloc, Soviet-controlled country. I mean, you think about it. Your bars are being raided by the police. Your phones are being tapped by the FBI. You're being swept up in these arrests at night. You're being sent to mental institutions, which is what the Soviet Union used to do to political dissidents. They'd say they were crazy and send them to mental institutions. So it's a very kind of, here we are fighting communism abroad, right? And yet to be a gay person in America at that time was like being a dissident in a Soviet country.
And was there, I guess, a conflict between the underground? In other words, was life in the bar at that point? Was life in the bars in the underground gay world more open than it was? Well, when did that happen? Because I realized when I was in Washington in the 70s, 80s, it was more kind of like this underground thriving. But was that not the case?
No, in the 40s and 50s, you would go to a gay bar and you would have an alias. First of all, everyone knew each other by a first name. You would never say your last name. And people had aliases, right? They had sort of like their gay name that they would use
in the clubs.
Because you might not know. Maybe the person you're talking to is an informant for the FBI, or whatnot. So it was a very underground scene. And there were only a handful of bars. There weren't really any sort of designated gay bars in the late 1940s, 50s. They were not advertised as such. Right. It was sort of understood. This was a place where you might be welcomed, where the staff would let you in, and they would. Because also remember, in many states in the country, it was illegal to sell liquor to homosexuals. I mean, that's how in New York. That's why in New York and in many cities across the country, actually during this era, the gay bars were all run by the mafia. Right. Because they would pay off the police, and that's part of the history of the Stonewall Uprising in New York City in 1969. Was that bar was owned by the mafia because they were the only people willing to engage in that sort of underground economy.
Did that, if I could jump ahead a little bit, did that change over the years? In other words, was there this sort of culture, Republican, Democratic, openly gay, underground, but not
right? So in the 70s and 80s, the period you're talking about, that's after Stonewall. You have gay people are coming out of the closet. It's becoming a little more acceptable. And Barney Frank, the great congressman from Massachusetts, he described gay bars in the 1980s as sort of a neutral Switzerland. In the sense that it was still a dangerous time to be gay politically. It was a real liability, and so you'd have people who during the day they'd be out fighting each other politically, right? You'd have Republicans fighting Democrats. You'd have people working for labor unions or at war with people working for corporate interests. But then they would all come into that gay bar. And they were all equal in that sense. It was a great sort of democracy in that sense because everyone sort of had everyone else's number. And there's a story that I tell in the book where there's you know him, a man named Sean Strube, who was an elevator operator in the Senate. And one night he was out at this big discotheque called the Lost and Found. It was sort of the biggest, the hottest disco in the 1970s, gay disco. And he, made eyes with some guy across the bar, and they started talking. And then the next day, Sean is he's a young college student. He's in the elevator, operating the elevator, and then who walks into the elevator? This very distinguished senator, followed by the man whom he met last night, who's his assistant. And they just sort of made eyes, and when the senator wasn't looking, the guy put his finger to his lips and said, "Do not say anything." And so that was to be a gay person in Washington, you had to kind of be a spy. And I think that's actually one of the reasons why I have a whole chapter in the book about the OSS, which was the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to the CIA. And there were a number of gay people in the OSS, because when you think about it, gay people were naturally suited to being spies. Because to be a spy, what do you have to do? You have to pretend to be someone you're not. You have to be very good at maybe reading signals and speaking in code, the whole kind of gay patois, of using language or a euphemism to describe certain things. And so it's ironic that in the 1950s, when the clampdown on gays begins and they're purging gay people from the State Department and the CIA, they're actually getting rid of a lot of people who were really good at what they were supposed to be doing. I mean, because gay people in this era are really good at keeping secrets. They're much better than anyone else because it was a matter of life and death.
But ironically, they were purging them because they thought of them as national security threats.
Yes. And the origins of this, it's interesting. The Defense Department did a study in 1991 where they analyzed something like 120 cases of Americans tried for treason, for selling secrets or giving secrets to a foreign power. 6 of them were gay, but not a single one of them had done so because of blackmail, right? So they had done it for money or maybe for some ideological reasons or whatever. But there was not a single example in the history of the United States of a gay person being blackmailed because they were gay. In the whole origin of this sort of myth that gays were susceptible, the only evidence that was ever cited was a case involving the head of the Austro-Hungarian Empire's counterintelligence service. His name was Colonel Alfred Radel, and in 1913 he was found to be selling secrets to the Russians. And he was gay, and the story that the regime put out was he had been blackmailed because he was gay. And this story, the Radel case, became this sort of paradigmatic case study that, decades later, Alan Dulles, who's the first civilian director of the CIA, he's referring to it. He wrote several books about espionage where he talks about this case. If you spoke to anyone involved in sort of Western intelligence during the Cold War about this issue of homosexuals in the intelligence world, they would have gone back to the Radel case. Then it turns out, actually, after the Cold War ended and the Russian archives opened, researchers discovered that the Russians didn't even know that Radel was gay. And in fact, his handler had referred to him as a lover of women. So the reason Radel was selling secrets to the Russians had nothing to do with him being blackmailed. It had to do with the fact that he had 5 cars, he had a wine cellar, he had a very expensive lifestyle, like a lot of spies, right? They want to live large, and you can't live large on a spy's salary, so you find other means of employment, right? So the entire basis for this justification was false.
Generally speaking, though, do you think that it was harder to be a gay person in Washington during that period because of the fear of extortion? Let's leave blackmail aside, but the fear of being outed, was that why people...
Yes, if you're a politician, obviously,
right,
that was
career death.
And
what about an aide? Would you lose your job, for
example?
Yes,
and I tell several heartbreaking stories of people. One of them very close to LBJ, a man named Bob Waldron, who was a very dedicated servant to Lyndon Johnson, dating back to when he was Senate Majority Leader, followed him when he became vice president. He's traveling all over the world. And then LBJ tries to bring him on to his vice presidential staff, right, at which point he would have to undergo he would have to undergo a security background check. And that was where you really ran into trouble. And so the background check begins just around the time of the Kennedy assassination. Mm-hmm. And so as Waldron's moving with LBJ into the White House, these investigators from the Civil Service Commission, they interview dozens of people, right? And they find one man who tells the investigators he tells them this story about how one night, years earlier, they were sharing a bed and Waldron made a pass at him. And that's all they needed. And with that information, Bob Waldron was gone. His White House pass was revoked. He'd been very close to not only LBJ, but Lady Bird and their daughters. He would spend a lot of time with them. And he was basically exiled from the White House. And there are countless cases like this. I mean, it's estimated that anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 people were terminated in the federal government because of their sexual orientation, a number that's maybe roughly equal to the number of people who were fired for communistic or left-wing sympathies. And I would actually argue this is worse because...
So to ask, it's worse, it was harder being gay?
Well, I would say it's materially worse in the sense that being gay was not a threat, whereas
Right.
if you were a member of the Communist Party, you probably should not be working at the State
Right.
Department, right? So, I mean, there were lots of innocent people who were swept up in the McCarthy period, but there was a justification for that fear, right? There was a justification for the fear of communist infiltration. Alger Hiss, there's 2 chapters on the Hiss Chambers case. Alger Hiss was a very prominent Soviet spy. McCarthy obviously blew it out of proportion and ruined many innocent lives, but there was no justification for what happened to gay people.
Do you think it was harder being gay or lesbian in Washington than in other major cities in the country in that period?
So,
including New York,
yeah,
including
so
LA?
it was, and it's interesting because I said earlier, Washington. So it was simultaneously one of the gayest cities in America, and also the most anti-gay city in America, which is appropriate.
Wow.
Which is
Really?
appropriate because Washington is also the capital of hypocrisy. So it's very fitting. And I think the reason why it was so gay is because, look, if you're a young man and you're not married, you don't have kids, you can spend those late nights working for your boss. You can answer that phone at 2 in the morning. You can work that extra mile to work in the State Department, right? You're traveling around the world. If you're a bachelor by a certain age, people become suspicious of you and start asking questions. But if you're a foreign diplomat and you're going from post to post every couple of years and you're a bachelor, then that's sort of a more, people might believe that that's legit, right? So there are jobs in Washington that gay people, particularly gay men, I think we're uniquely suited for, and particularly during the New Deal, when Washington is growing into this massive federal bureaucracy and there's all these new jobs available. If you're a young gay person from the provinces, right, from some small town, you would be attracted to a place like Washington. But then the fear sets in around World War II and the Cold War, and so you have this, perverse situation where you have a lot of gay people in Washington, and they're working very hard all throughout the government. Yet there is this official campaign against you. And that doesn't exist to the same extent in a place like Los Angeles or New York, where there are certain industries. I mean, Hollywood during that golden era, interestingly, was a relatively open place. And there were a number of gay men and lesbians who worked in Hollywood. They were sort of able to get away with it. And there were obviously famous cases, people like Billy Haynes, who was forced to give up his career in Hollywood. He was told by the studio exec, I can't remember which one it was, who said, it's either your boyfriend or your job, and we'll set you up with a nice woman, and you can do that, or you can stay with your partner. And he chose to stay with his partner, and he obviously became one of the great interior decorators of the time. But LA was a more welcoming place. Hollywood, New York, you have certain industries where there was a kind of toleration for it. But Washington is the national capital, right, of this national security state and of our government, and it's also where this anti-gay hysteria is really emanating from. So it's a real pressure cooker.
There were examples in your book of people who were out early on. Do you think, how hard was that to be, and do you think they were less vulnerable because they were out to blackmail than, say, a straight person who was involved in an affair?
So the people who were out were not really involved in politics because you couldn't. And so, I'll give an example of a story that's important to understand. There was a man named Frank Kameny who was a Harvard-trained PhD astronomer, and he's working for the Army Map Service in 1957, which is the sort of military wing of the space program. And he is, this is December 1957, so it's 2 months after the Soviets launched Sputnik into space. So it's the height of the space race. And he's working at an observatory out in Hawaii. And he gets summoned all the way back to Washington, D.C., where he's told by the federal government that, we have evidence that you're a homosexual and we're going to fire you. And this goes to my point about being a homosexual was more dangerous than being a communist. Think about this. The federal government would have rather fired a gay Harvard-trained PhD astronomer at the height of the space race. They'd rather get rid of him because he was such a threat than use his talents and his knowledge and his intellect in the space race against the Soviets. And so what Kameny does is he becomes the first gay federal employee who's fired to actually fight back. Thousands of people had been fired up to that point. And the thing is, if you wanted to challenge this in the 1950s, that would mean going public, right? To file a lawsuit, you had to put your name on the docket. And to declare yourself a homosexual in 1953, 4 or 5, that was like death. You would never get a job anywhere. So if you were accused of this and you lost your job, people would just leave town quietly, right? They didn't want to protest. And what Frank did was really heroic. He says, you know what, this is wrong. There's nothing about my sexual orientation that should disqualify me. And he decides to fight back. He tries to get the ACLU to help him. Not even the ACLU would take his case. So again, the ACLU is defending communists and people accused of communism, right? They would not take the case of a homosexual in 1957. So he writes his own legal brief, a man with no legal training. And you can read it. It's an amazing document. And he tries to appeal his case to the Supreme Court. They don't even listen to the case. He decides to found an organization called the Mattachine Society of Washington. And they found it in room 120 of the Hay Adams Hotel, the hotel directly across the street from the White House, in September 1961. And it's really the first serious, sustained gay rights organization in the United States. And they have a couple of members, and some people are, working in the government. Their first meeting, by the way, is infiltrated by both the FBI and the Metropolitan Police Department of D.C. The Metropolitan Police Department of D.C. was not led by the smartest man at the time, because the undercover police officer whom they chose to infiltrate this meeting was the same undercover police officer, he was a very handsome man, who they sent out to the public restrooms to entrap men in public restrooms. So a lot of the men in that meeting recognized this person. So they caught on to him pretty quickly. But that was the first real gay rights organization. And that group, the Mattachine Society, they have the first demonstration for gay rights outside the White House in 1965. That's 4 years before Stonewall. And there's a photo of it in my book. And it's all these very well-dressed, all the men are wearing ties and suit jackets. Frank told all the women they had to wear heeled shoes. They couldn't wear flat shoes. They had to wear skirts below the knee. Because he would say, if you want to be employed, you need to look employable. And so it was a very kind of small c conservative movement, and they were holding signs with very simple statements, equal rights for homosexuals. They were very clearly modeling themselves on the African-American civil rights movement in Martin Luther King, sort of, peaceful civil rights demonstrations. But that's an example. He had to sacrifice everything to be out, and so there was a lot of sacrifice involved among that generation of early gay rights activists, because you were really limiting your life possibilities. And so when you asked me what was it like to write this book, I've countless times writing this book, researching it, I would think, if I had been born 50, 60 years earlier than I was, I would have had none of the opportunities that I've had. My being gay has never really, I'm sure there are opportunities that I've been denied, maybe jobs or whatnot, but at this point in my life, I wouldn't want those jobs or opportunities. But I've never really been harmed by being gay. But that's clearly would not have been true not so long ago. Really within living memory, your opportunities were extremely circumscribed. And so I think the progress that the gay rights movement made in this country, it's really the most remarkable thing. There's no other movement that has achieved so much
in such a short period
of time. If you look at the status of the American homosexual, when my book begins, they are deemed mentally insane by the medical institutions of this country. They are enemies of the state. Their behavior is illegal. They're condemned from the pulpit of every major religion. And to go from that to where we are today, there's been no other issue in the history of public polling that has shown such a rapid or dramatic change than the various questions related to homosexuality. Gay marriage being obviously one of them, where hardly anyone supported it in the 1970s, right? And now a majority of Republicans now support gay marriage. Or, questions like, is homosexuality immoral or whatnot? There's no other issue in the history of public polling that has witnessed such a dramatic transformation. And it's due to people like Frank. Yeah.
Let's talk about some of the early figures in your book that help people here understand just how much things have changed. Talk about Senator David Walsh. Tell the story about how he was destroyed, I guess, by the left,
Yes.
and whether that says anything about
Yeah.
what we assume about the left and gay rights.
Yeah, so David Walsh was a conservative Democrat senator from Massachusetts, and he was the chairman of the Naval Committee. And in May 1952, the New York Post, which at the time, I know this is going to be very difficult for you all to believe, at the time, the New York
Maybe not
Post,
this crowd,
the New York Post was a liberal newspaper in 1942. This is
Dorothy Schiff, right?
Dorothy Schiff was a legendary publisher, and it was the newspaper, sort of the New York liberal intelligentsia. It was pro-FDR, it was pro-intervention, pro-New Deal. David Walsh was a conservative Democrat who he was an America Firster, he opposed American involvement in World War II, he was an opponent of FDR, he actually supported another Democratic candidate when FDR tried to run for a third term. So he was an enemy of FDR. And in May 1942, and this date is important because it's after America entered the Second World War. Prior to that, there were obviously gay politicians, but they had never been exposed before publicly. After World War II, the calculus changes, right? Because there's this national security threat. And the New York Post prints on its front page the accusation that a certain Senator X was spotted at a male brothel in Brooklyn, near the Brooklyn Naval Yard. So this is a national security issue now, all of a sudden, right? And over the following days, for about a week, they publish more and more details, but they don't reveal Senator X's name. And it's all these details about people who witnessed him and whatnot, and they were also alleging that there were Nazi spies at this brothel. So this is a great, and what's also interesting is that just 3 weeks before this story broke, the New York Post went from being a broadsheet newspaper to a tabloid. So this is this is Nazis, gays, rent boys, this is spies.
Perfect.
This is the perfect tabloid story. It doesn't get any better than this. And then they name him, and they publish his photograph. So this is the first outing in American politics. You know, the term outing, when you reveal a closeted gay person's identity. This is the first outing in American politics. And quietly, FDR was supporting this because he didn't like David Walsh. David Walsh was one of his critics, right? And it ended up being a case of mistaken identity, actually. Walsh probably was gay, but, and this shows you the kind of journalistic values of the time, all that it would have required was looking at his Senate attendance record, and they would have been able to tell that he was actually voting in the Senate at the dates that he was alleged to have been at this brothel. But his reputation was destroyed, he lost re-election, and this shows you that, you know, we think of sort of gay rights as being a left-wing or liberal or progressive cause. That only really became the case around the 1970s with the rise of the modern gay rights movement. Before that, everyone would use this political weapon against anyone else. I mean, liberals were no better than conservatives. If it suited your purposes, it was a weapon that you could use. And there are other cases that I document in the book. You know, the Alger Hiss Whittaker Chambers case. That's an example where you had really the kind of progressive elite in the United States using accusations of homosexuality to discredit Whittaker Chambers, who was a former Soviet spy and a leading conservative writer at the time. They were using these sort of homophobic insinuations to discredit him. And there are other examples of this, and it doesn't really change. The issue of homosexuality doesn't become a partisan issue that we identify with the left really until the 1970s or even early 1980s.
This seems to lead in naturally to Roy Cohn.
Yes.
How much does this environment account for what seems to be the tortured life of Roy Cohn? Can you talk a little bit on how he fit in? And I'm also curious, as part of this, was it well known that he was gay in Washington at the time? Was he practicing or was he discreet?
So, if you're familiar with the Army McCarthy hearings, which were watched by 1 out of every 2 Americans at the time, this was sort of Joe McCarthy's end, where he decided to take on the military, right, and accuse the military of harboring communists. Not a great idea to do that. And at his side is this young, very ambitious, very intelligent attorney, Roy Cohn. And the background to this is that Roy Cohn had been berating the military to get an exemption for another staffer, another McCarthy staffer named David Shine, who was this very handsome, dim-witted heir to a hotel fortune.
So a Twinkie?
Well, he was 6 feet tall. He was described And again, this is how people would refer to this at the time. They would say, why is Roy Cohn so obsessed with getting David Schein out of the military? Because this was back during the draft, during the Korean War. Why is he so obsessed with getting this young man who happens to look like a Greek god out of the military? So that's how they would refer to it. Again, the word homosexual was never used, right? And there's that famous moment during the Army McCarthy hearings where, you're all familiar with the moment when McCarthy really is done with, when the lawyer for the Army says, have you no decency, sir? Which everyone has seen that. That same lawyer, this is another example, by the way, of kind of liberal homophobia. That same lawyer who's Joe Welch, who's rightly understood as being a hero for kind of putting an end to McCarthyism, just a couple weeks earlier during that trial, during those hearings, there was a photograph entered into evidence, and they were debating the provenance of this photograph. And Joe Welch was saying, where did that photograph come from? Did it come from a pixie? And Joe McCarthy said, what's a pixie? And Joe Welch says, looking right at Roy Cohn, it's a close relative of a fairy. Right? And so there was a clear, you can basically understand the downfall. The downfall of Joe McCarthy was basically due to the lust of Roy Cohn for another man. That's what basically set up that whole Army McCarthy hearing, right? And there's so many other examples of this in the book, of these kind of major historical moments or phenomena where homosexuality is a major subtext. But because at the time it was such a taboo subject, it wasn't written about explicitly. And so what I really try to do in the book is show the reader and ask the reader to reconsider all these events, all these personalities, all these phenomena, from World War II to the war between the CIA and the FBI, the African American Civil Rights Movement, the Cold War, McCarthyism, and to see that there's this through line of this fear and fascination with same-sex desire that goes through all these events and personalities.
How did Roy Cohn survive? Obviously, McCarthy didn't survive that; he died a couple of years later. How did Roy Cohn survive for 20 more years?
Well, he leaves Washington. Right? He leaves Washington at the Army McCarthy. He's still a political power broker, but he goes to New York and he's involved in other realms. He's a high-powered attorney.
Trump.
He
right?
obviously goes on to work for Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And he lived this. He'd be going out to Studio 54, right? While at night, while during the day. He'd be having lunch with Phyllis Schlafly or something, So it was this very kind of bizarre life. I think the reason was, and this is another theme in the book, was that people were willing to kind of make allowances for some of these gay men if they were very good at their jobs. And so Roy Cohn, whatever you want to say about him, was really good at what he did. Mm-hmm. And so he had this kind of hold on McCarthy, where, he was doing all these crazy things working for Joe McCarthy. But he clearly was able to convince McCarthy that he was worth protecting and worth having on his staff. And you see this repeatedly with these gay aides to various presidents or politicians, that they were they were kind of willing to overlook the gay thing until it became a liability, right? And once it became a liability, then those men were done. Their careers were over.
I want to ask you, and then we'll take questions from the crowd here. One thing that's interesting about your book is there's always been this sort of conventional gossipy wisdom that Hoover was gay, right?
J. Edgar Hoover.
I'm sorry, J. Edgar
Not
Hoover.
Herbert Hoover.
God forbid. But you seem skeptical. I'm agnostic on this. You seem skeptical about that. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and how in our culture we often sort of decide someone's gay, and it just becomes part of, even though there's no proof for it, right?
So, the rumors about Hoover date back to when he was just starting what was called the Bureau of Investigation before it became the FBI. And you can read these newspaper reports and magazine articles about him in the 1930s, noting he has a certain mince in his step. He lives alone with his mother. He's a bachelor, and he likes to collect antiques. And that's something I learned in this book, was that collecting antiques was seen as sort of a kind of gay pastime. So they would sort of, drop these hints, right? But again, no one would ever say it. And it's an amazing kind of paradox when you think about this book, right? Was that the man sitting atop this national security bureaucracy who was collecting secrets on everyone and ruining people's lives, right, was himself maybe, or rumored to be gay. Rumored to be gay. And that has to do with the fact that, yes, he was a bachelor, and also he had this very, I'll just say, he had a very devoted relationship with his assistant, Clyde Tolson, at the FBI. You know, they're buried just a couple of plots from each other in Congressional Cemetery. They lived right near each other. They traveled together. They had lunch every day at Harvey's Restaurant or the Mayflower in Washington, and this naturally led to speculation. They would go together to events at the White House, right, as if they were like a married couple. Probably the most notorious aspect of this is the claim that J. Edgar Hoover was a cross-dresser, right? And if you saw the movie J. Edgar, directed by Clint Eastwood, there's a scene where Leonardo DiCaprio, puts on his mother's dress and is looking at the mirror. It's very sappy, and there's also no evidence that it was ever true. I mean, but the reason for this, the cross-dressing thing, it came from a very sort of sensationalist biography that was written of Hoover in the early 1990s, and the claim came from the widow of a mob boss who was paid for the story by the British journalist, and she told this story about, she was at the Plaza Hotel in New York, and she witnessed J. Edgar Hoover and Roy Cohn, Hoover involved in an orgy with underage boys, and Hoover was wearing a fluffy red dress. Now, what this woman was doing at an all-male orgy in the Plaza Hotel is, but that, I mean, if you talk to people today about J. Edgar Hoover, probably the first thing that they associate with him was that he was a cross-dresser. It's just become part of our kind of cultural lore, but there's no evidence for it. And look, there's no. Is it possible that J. Edgar Hoover was a homosexual? I don't know. I don't know what was in the man's heart. Right. Certainly, I can't make that declaration in the book. I'm a historian. I'm looking at facts. I have to present the evidence and let the reader decide for themselves. But there's no evidence that he was gay.
We'll probably never know, right?
We'll probably never know.
Thank you. Let's open this up to questions. Okay. Oh, great. We have a microphone. All I ask is that you identify yourself and finish that sentence with a question mark.
My name is Gary, and I so appreciate, thank you. It's been very entertaining. You probably heard my screams over here of joy. Two things, quickly. There was a play written just locally called The Lincoln Debate.
The Lincoln Debate?
Yes, it was regarding Lincoln sleeping for 4 years with a man who owned a store that he rented a room from or a bed. But my real topic, since you did get to Cohn and Hoover, was Hoover's investigation of someone I was fortunate to call my friend, Leonard Bernstein. Mm-hmm. What the heck did Hoover have to do with investigating Bernstein? Fortunately, that file is now open and in the Bernstein archives.
Well, the FBI investigated all sorts of cultural figures. They were not just limited at this time to government employees. Any sort of left-wing, not even left-wing, I mean, Rock Hudson had an FBI file. And it's interesting because Rock Hudson was portraying, in some 1965 movie, he was going to be portraying an FBI agent. And there's actually a file that the FBI was concerned because there are all these rumors of Mr. Hudson being a homosexual. And is it, good for the Bureau to have this known homosexual portraying an FBI agent? And they were able to get the studio to change the script so that he wasn't an FBI, he was just sort of a government agent of some sort. They were able to remove the FBI designation. It's interesting you ask about that because if you look at the evolution in this sort of attitude towards Hoover, Henry Kissinger, when he was becoming National Security Advisor to Richard Nixon, obviously had to undergo a security background check. And at the time, he was a bachelor. He was in between wives. And I interviewed a man who knew someone who was interviewed by the FBI as part of Henry Kissinger's background check. And they were sort of asking these leading questions. Sorry, he was a former graduate student of Henry Kissinger's at Harvard. They're just asking him, regular questions, because he was a foreign-born citizen, right? You have to ask these sorts of questions. And they started asking these questions about the fact that he's a bachelor, are there any women in his life, whatnot. And they eventually got to the point where they just asked this guy, do you have any information about whether or not Mr. Kissinger is a homosexual? This would have been in 1969, right? And by this point, Hoover was no longer sort of the feared figure that he was in the 1940s and 50s. And so they asked this man, do you have any information about whether Mr. Kissinger is a homosexual? And the man said to the two FBI agents interviewing him, well, I don't have any information on that, but your boss might. So, and there were one or two other stories I came across by the late 1960s, early 70s, where people were being interviewed by the FBI about other people and their sex lives, and they kind of felt at that point, free enough to be able to tell an FBI agent, to basically make a joke about Hoover being gay.
Hi, my name's Kathy, and I'd like to know if there's one particular thing you can cite that was the most surprising to find out during your research.
The most surprising thing was definitely this Reagan story that I uncovered. I didn't really understand until I started researching this book the real kind of fear that surrounded the Reagan folks, the Reagan people, about Reagan being perceived as gay. And this dates all the way back to when he was an actor. And he was in a movie called Dark Victory with Bette Davis in 1938, where he's basically playing Bette Davis's gay best friend in that film. And he writes about this in his memoir. That's very hard to find. He wrote a kind of campaign memoir. He didn't write it, his ghostwriter did. When he was running for governor, it's called Where's the Rest of Me? And he talks about the making of this movie. And the director was a British gay director named Edmund Goulding. And he described how Goulding wanted him to play this role. And he said that he wanted me to play the role of Bette Davis's friend as if I was the sort of fellow who could sit in the girls' dressing room and dish with them while they get dressed. Which is a very long euphemistic way of saying he wanted me to play a gay guy, right? And so he was very angry about this. He did not like the fact that he was being asked to play, a lavender lad or something like that. That was the term that they might have used. And then if you read, what was Lynn Nofziger's memoir? They talk about in 1967 when there was this gay scandal in Reagan's first term as governor, how they were very concerned that people might think Reagan himself was gay because he was an actor and he came from Hollywood. And there's a lot of, Nofziger says there's where many homosexuals are known to live in Hollywood, right? And he had lots of gay friends. Nancy basically only had gay male friends. I mean, there's an entire, if you look at the photo insert in this book, I have an entire page, and it just says all the First Lady's men, and it's just photos of Nancy with her hairdresser, with Ted Graeber, with all her lobbyists, her dress designer, Jimmy Galanos. I mean, so they came from this very kind of, gay chic world. Billy Haynes was their interior decorator, right? So by the time 1980 rolls around and he's running for president, and there's these rumors circulating that he's being controlled by a gay cabal, it doesn't sound so, now we can look at this and sort of laugh and scoff at it, but it didn't seem so crazy at the time. Certainly not crazy enough that Ben Bradley would assign his crack team of investigative reporters to look into it. I mean, it was considered a legitimate enough story at the time to investigate. And that was just, I didn't really understand that until writing this book.
Any more?
Hi there. I'm Barbara. You've told us a lot of stories about the males who were discriminated against and suffered. Yeah. Could you give us some examples of some of the females?
Yeah. So the book is obviously male-dominated, and there are several reasons for that. One is that women did not really have senior jobs in government really until the 1990s, which is crazy when you think about that. I mean, the Clinton administration, from FDR has the first female, Frances Perkins, the first female cabinet secretary, who, by the way, was a lesbian, right? And then every other president might have like one woman cabinet secretary, and she was always in Health and Human Services, like one of the caring departments, right? And it's really not until Clinton where you have, a woman attorney general, and you have multiple women in various, obviously you have Hillary Clinton, who's a very outspoken women's advocate. And so women didn't really have security clearances in Washington. So they were not really susceptible to the kind of internal security state. They were not being investigated. They didn't have access to secrets in the way that men did. Also, lesbians, how can I put this? Lesbians have a different sort of sex life than gay men do. Lesbians were not meeting each other in public restrooms or parks, in kind of public places, which is how gay men were forced to meet in that era of time. So they were not encountering law enforcement. They were not being arrested in the vast numbers that, say, gay men were. Now, I'm just explaining this as kind of why there are so few women in the book. None of this is to say that there were not lesbians who did lose their jobs, particularly in the State Department, where they might have been secretaries to various high-powered diplomats. And so there were a number of women, lesbian women, who were victims of the Lavender Scare. But really until the 1990s, which is around the same time that Washington's beginning to open up and be a more accessible place for gay people, that's when women are also kind of getting more senior jobs and positions. Yeah.
All right. At this point, we would like to thank James and Adam for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
As I mentioned before,
Thanks
if
so
you
much.
are interested in having
Thank you.
James ask him a question, sign a book, take a picture, please line up along this wall here, and we'll get you guys going in just a moment here.